The moment Dante Moretti's champagne flute touched the tray of a passing server, every conversation within 20 feet of Symphony Hall's east alcove died without explanation. No one could have articulated why. The sound was barely audible, a single precise clink of crystal against silver, but something in the air changed. The way it changes when a predator stops pretending to be still. Reid Holbrook felt it a half-second too late. The Boston Symphony Hall had been borrowed for the evening, its cavernous grandeur reconfigured into a sea of white linen cocktail tables and cascading floral arrangements in cream and gold. 200 invitations had been sent. Every one of them had been accepted. At $3,000 a plate, the Halcyon Children's Medical Foundation expected to raise enough tonight to fund a new pediatric oncology wing at Mass General. The donors who came did so with the practiced generosity of people who understood that visibility was its own kind of currency. Camille Ashford did not belong to that world. She was acutely, almost painfully aware of it. She stood in the east alcove with the other 3 members of the string quartet, re-rosening her bow before the second set began. Her gown was borrowed. A floor-length navy blue shift she'd found at a consignment shop in Cambridge 3 days ago. And her shoes were the same low heels she wore to medical school presentations. She was 27 years old, a second-year student at Boston University School of Medicine. And she was here because the quartet's regular violinist had broken her wrist at a spin class on Thursday, and their coordinator had called Camille in a panic because Camille Ashford was the most technically precise replacement violinist in Greater Boston. She was not here because anyone had invited her. She was here because she was useful. The distinction had never bothered her more than it did tonight, surrounded by the careless opulence of people who had never once wondered whether they could afford the heating bill. Across the hall, Dante Moretti stood slightly apart from the cluster of donors surrounding the foundation's board chairman, holding a glass of champagne he had no intention of drinking. To the city of Boston and to every financial publication that had ever profiled him, Dante was the chairman of Moretti Capital, a private equity firm with a portfolio valued conservatively at $4 billion. He was known for his restraint, his silence during negotiations, and his unnerving ability to predict which companies were about to collapse before their own boards could see it coming. He donated generously to medical causes. He appeared at the right events. He wore bespoke suits that looked like discipline. To the men who moved in the syndicate's shadow, the network of legitimate businesses, pressured suppliers, and deliberately obscured financial structures that spanned Boston, Providence, and New York, Dante was something else entirely. He was the architect. He was the reason the Northeast's organized crime ecosystem had not devolved into open war in 11 years. He was the kind of man you did not get to walk away from having wronged. He had been watching Camille Ashford for 40 minutes. Not in the way that word implied to outsiders. He had been watching her the way he watched everything, cataloging, reading the information she unconsciously broadcast, the tension in her left shoulder as she played, the way she angled slightly away from the cocktail crowd between sets, not from shyness, but from a hard-earned instinct to protect her bow arm from careless guests, the way she smiled precisely enough when the coordinator checked in on her, professional, warm, complete, and then let the smile dissolve the instant the woman turned away. She was exhausted. She was underpaid for this, and she was extraordinarily good. He had commissioned 3 private recitals in the last decade. He knew what extraordinary sounded like. Dante had not originally planned to learn Camille Ashford's name. He'd heard her play 4 months ago at a private dinner in Back Bay and had simply asked his assistant who the violinist was. The summary came back routine. Medical student, part-time musician, Cambridge address, no notable associations. Then, 2 months later, her name appeared on a document that crossed his desk in a very different context. His director of intelligence had been monitoring Reid Holbrook for other reasons entirely. Holbrook was a mid-level associate director at Stonebridge Capital, who had, over the past 3 years, quietly redirected client investment funds into a series of shell companies incorporated in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. The SEC hadn't found it yet. They would. The trail was too clean to be invisible forever, which was its own kind of arrogance. But what made Dante set down his coffee and read the dossier twice was a single page near the back. A shell company, registered to an address in Cambridge, primary guarantor signature, Camille Ashford. The shell company had been incorporated 22 months ago. At the time, Camille had been in a 2-year relationship with Reid Holbrook. According to Holbrook's own financial records, which Dante's people had accessed through channels that would not appear in any court document, Holbrook had told her she was signing a lease amendment for their shared apartment. The document she had actually signed was a guarantor agreement, making her the primary liable party for a shell company used to cycle $4.2 million in embezzled client funds. When the SEC eventually audited Stonebridge Capital, they would not come for Reid Holbrook first. They would come for her. Dante had sat with that information for exactly 1 evening before he called his attorney. He had arranged to meet Camille 6 weeks ago at a smaller function for BU's medical school endowment. Not difficult, given that he was a significant donor to the university's research programs, and she was there as a student representative. He had not told her any of what he knew. He had simply talked to her about medicine, about the particular demands of memorizing pharmacological pathways while maintaining the motor precision required to play at a professional level. She had been guarded at first, the instinctive wariness of someone who had learned that the interest of powerful men came with invisible costs. But he had not pushed. He had been present and patient and genuinely interested, because he was. In the 5 weeks since, they had had dinner twice. Once at a small Ethiopian restaurant in Somerville, she clearly loved and had been uncertain he would tolerate. Once at a private dining room he kept at the Marlow Hotel, where she had looked around at the understated luxury and said, very quietly, "I keep waiting for the part where something's expected in return." He had told her nothing was. She hadn't entirely believed him. But she had come to the gala tonight, when he mentioned he would be attending, and she had allowed herself to look up from the music stand and find his eyes in the crowd with something that was not quite a smile, but was very close to one. Tonight had been going well, until the east alcove doors opened, and Reid Holbrook walked in with a client badge clipped to his jacket, and the particular loose-limbed confidence of a man 3 drinks ahead of the room. Dante saw him before Holbrook saw Camille. He watched Holbrook scan the room with the restless entitlement of someone who needed to be seen by the right people. Watched him stop, watched the recognition move across his face. Not the warm kind. The expression that settled over Holbrook's features was something Dante had seen before, on different men in different rooms. It was the expression of someone who had discarded something and resented finding it polished and intact in someone else's hands. Holbrook moved across the floor without excusing himself from the conversation he was abandoning. Camille looked up from her bow. The color left her face so completely and so quickly that it was visible from across the gala floor. "Well," Holbrook said, arriving at the edge of the alcove with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked her up and down in a way that was designed to diminish. "I didn't realize the quartet was hiring med school charity cases." "I haven't dropped out," Camille said. Her voice was steady. Her bow hand was not. Yet. Holbrook stepped closer, lowering his voice to the register that wanted to seem private but wasn't. "I need to talk to you. The SC sent a preliminary inquiry letter to Stonebridge last Thursday. You know what that means." Something shifted in Camille's expression. Not understanding, fear, old, learned fear, the kind that lives in the body before the mind has finished processing the threat. "That has nothing to do with me," she said. "It has everything to do with you." Holbrook reached out and closed his hand around her left arm, the bow arm just above the elbows. Enough to communicate ownership, enough to say, "I can make this worse. Your name is on a document. A document I'm going to need you to stay very quiet about. So why don't you put the violin down and come, have a conversation with me somewhere that isn't? Let go of her arm. The voice came from 2 feet behind Holbrook. It was not loud. It had the particular texture of a statement of fact rather than a request, the way you might observe that the weather had changed, or that a number on a balance sheet was wrong. Holbrook turned. He registered Dante in the way people often registered Dante for the first time, as a well-dressed man of no immediately obvious significance, slightly older, unremarkable at first glance. The glance never stayed first for long. "Mind your business," Holbrook said. "Your name is Reid Holbrook." Dante's gaze moved from Holbrook's face to the hand still gripping Camille's arm and back. "Associate Director, Stonebridge Capital. You grew up in Darien, Connecticut. You drive a leased BMW 7 Series you're 4 payments behind on, and you've been in contact with a structuring attorney in the Cayman Islands 6 times in the past 30 days, which I suspect has nothing to do with vacation planning." Holbrook's hand loosened. "Not enough. Who the hell are you?" "The preliminary inquiry letter you received Thursday references a shell company incorporated in Delaware," Dante continued, as though Holbrook hadn't spoken. "Sunrise Asset Management, LLC. Primary guarantor, Camille Ashford." He paused, precisely 1 beat. "What you don't know is that as of 9 o'clock this morning, the guarantor documentation for Sunrise Asset Management has been legally amended. The original signature was submitted to a forensic document examiner, retained by my legal team. The finding, already transmitted to the SEC's Enforcement Division, is that the signature was forged. The shell company has been retransferred, with full documentation, into your name, with your actual signature." The sound of the Gala continued around them. A senator laughed at something across the room. A cellist tuned her a string. Holbrook had stopped breathing. "The tip regarding Stonebridge Capital's client fund irregularities," Dante said softly, "will be formally submitted Monday morning. The documentation will be comprehensive. Your attorney in the Cayman Islands is, as of this week, no longer your attorney." He tilted his head, almost politely. "He works for me now." Holbrook's face had gone the color of old chalk. "You can't. How did you? Who are you?" "I'm the man she had dinner with last Tuesday." And then, after a pause so quiet, it was almost courteous. "And you've been holding her arm for 30 seconds longer than I'm willing to allow." Holbrook stepped back as though the floor had shifted. He looked at Camille, not with dominance now, but with the raw expression of a man who had just understood, with full physiological clarity, that he was standing in the wrong room. Camille was looking at Dante. Dante stepped forward and placed one hand gently at the small of her back, not pulling her away, just positioning himself between her and Holbrook, making the geometry of the moment unambiguous. "Marco," he said without raising his voice. The man who materialized at Holbrook's elbow was built like a closed door and wore an expression of total professional neutrality. Sian appeared at Holbrook's other side with identical composure. "Mr. Holbrook is going to want some water," Dante said pleasantly, "and then he's going to want to leave in that order." Holbrook did not speak again. He allowed himself to be guided away with the boneless compliance of a man who had already begun calculating how much trouble he was in and found the number to be very large. Camille didn't move for a long moment after they left. Dante intercepted the approaching Gala coordinator with a brief, quiet exchange that lasted 45 seconds, after which she nodded several times and went to inform the quartet that their second set would begin in 10 minutes and that the east alcove was reserved for the remainder of the evening. When she was gone, Dante turned back to Camille. "Are you hurt?" "No." She looked down at her arm, then up at him. Her voice was steady in the way voices go steady when the body is working too hard to keep them that way. "Dante, what did you mean the signature was forged? How long have you known about the shell company?" He held her gaze. He did not prevaricate. 11 days after I first heard you play," he said. "My director of intelligence encountered your name in a document that should never have had your name in it. I had my legal team examine the original filing the following week. The full weight of that settled over her slowly, the way cold water does. He was going to let the SEC come after me, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. I signed what I thought was a lease amendment. She stopped, pressed her lips together, recalibrated. He stood in our kitchen and handed me a pen and said it was a lease amendment. I know. And you fixed it. She said it with a complicated expression. Not relief yet, but the moment preceding relief, the breath before the knees give out, before I even knew I was in danger. The danger is gone, he said simply. The liability is precisely where it belongs. Camille was quiet for a long moment, her violin hanging at her side. Why? She finally asked. You didn't know me, you didn't owe me anything. Dante looked at her, the borrowed gown, the rehearsed composure, the particular tiredness of someone who had been holding themselves together for a very long time and was only now beginning to calculate the cost. Because the first time I heard you play, he said, you made 60 people forget they were strangers, and then you packed up your case and took the tea home. A pause. Someone like that should not be looking over her shoulder. The second set began at 9:15. Camille Ashford stood at the front of the string quartet and played Ravel's string quartet in F with the kind of precision that made the cavernous hall go genuinely, unperformatively still. Not the polite quiet of an audience following a social script, the real kind, the held breath kind. Dante stood at the edge of the room and did not touch his champagne. At 9:47, when the set ended and the applause moved through the crowd like a small tide, Camille looked up from her music stand. She found him without searching. She did not perform a smile. She let him see the real one, brief, certain, the kind that comes after something difficult has been survived, and the body is finally beginning to believe it. After the gala ended, after the foundation's coordinator pressed a check and a handshake into Camille's palm and thanked her with genuine relief, Camille stepped out of Symphony Hall into the cool October air of Huntington Avenue. A black Escalade was idling at the curb. Marco stood beside the rear door and, as she approached, inclined his head. Not a courtesy nod, but something quieter and more deliberate. The deferential bow of a man acknowledging someone who has earned it. She slid into the back seat. Dante followed. For a while neither of them spoke. The city moved past the tinted windows, its lights fracturing across the glass. I want you to know, Camille said eventually, watching the Charles River appear, and then disappear as they crossed the bridge, that I understand who you are. I looked up the Moretti name the same night we met. I assumed you had. I found things. I imagine. She turned from the window to look at him. I'm not afraid of what I found. Dante waited. I've spent 2 years learning that the human body has more ways to fail than anyone wants to know about, she said, and that the only reasonable response to that fact is to get very good at what you do and to find people you can trust beside you in the room. She paused. I don't trust easily. I know. But I trust you. She said it clearly, without hesitation or performance, the way a physician states a diagnosis she has considered carefully and arrived at with confidence. I trust you, and I'd like to keep having dinner with you, and I'd like to stop pretending I don't know what kind of man you are while we do it. Dante looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Then we won't pretend, he said. She nodded once, as though that settled something that had needed settling, and turned back to the window. Boston's skyline moved past them, bright and indifferent, full of 1,000 closed rooms where 1,000 versions of power moved through channels most people would never see. In the back of the Escalade, Camille Ashford held her violin case in her lap and felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely name, that she was not navigating that world alone. She had walked into that gala as someone Reid Holbrook had once made small. She left it as someone he would spend the rest of his life wishing he had never noticed.